History is filled with no end of intriguing stories and interesting people. In this compilation, we explore a variety of absorbing and thought-provoking tales, sure to make you say, "Well, I never." We begin this compilation with a gripping mystery, one that has persisted for over 100 years. The Eilean Mor lighthouse was only the second structure ever built on the largest of the 7 Flannan Isles, a remote, rocky group of small islands in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. Eilean Mor, also known as the Big Island of the 7 Hunters, had been largely avoided for as long as anyone could remember. For centuries, the only inhabitants were sheep stored on the island by shepherds to keep them safe from poachers. The only sign of human life was the crumbling ruin of a small chapel and the remains of an ancient cross dating back to the 7th century. It's unclear when or why these superstitions about the Flannan Isles began, but the place has long been believed to be home to unusual supernatural powers, with many believing it was an intersection between the world of the living and the dead. Visitors to the remote isle described becoming overcome with a deep sense of foreboding, and those who dared mount its rocky shores were quick to fall into prayer and superstitious ritual to prevent the gloomy feeling of the place from taking hold of them. Superstitions aside, there was no denying that the Flannan Isles were dangerous for ships. Weather conditions in Outer Hebrides changed quickly and drastically, with winds and tide catching many captains off their guard and condemning countless vessels to doom upon the jagged rocks. In 1896, the Board of Trade approved the building of a light on Eilean Mor, and on December 7, 1899, the lamp blazed for the first time, its signal visible for 20 miles. The 75-foot-tall White Tower sits on a towering 200-foot cliff overlooking the steel-grey waters of the Atlantic. Though the lighthouse was a brand-new outpost, few keepers were eager to take on the role. While the duty of a lighthouse keeper was seemingly simple, it was far from an easy life. Keepers lived for months in cramped, isolated conditions. The days were spent cleaning, painting, and maintaining the building, while their nights were spent in rotation with other keepers always watching to ensure the lamp never went out. Some lighthouses were situated near a town or village, while others were in areas of remote beauty, abundant in nature and wildlife. Eilean Mor was neither of those. Apart from a thriving seabird population, there was little of interest on the remote wild island. And during their shifts, keepers were utterly cut off from the outside world. There was no telegraph, no radio, and definitely no postman. There was not even a boat for emergencies. The closest neighbours were on the Isle of Lewis, across 16 miles of choppy seas with no way to reach them. James Duckett was a seasoned keeper who served at several lighthouses, including a nearly 8-year stint at Rins of Eilean in the Inner Hebrides, when he agreed to take the job. The 43-year-old father of 4 had recently earned a promotion to principal keeper, but he was hesitant about the Eilean Mor posting. Duckett felt the remote island was a poor location to send someone with a young family and had heard plenty of rumours about the area's reputation. Duckett was joined by assistant keeper Thomas Marshall, an unmarried 31-year-old with several years of lighthouse keeping and maritime experience under his belt, and Donald MacArthur, a 40-year-old occasional lightkeeper filling in for assistant keeper William Ross, who was on sick leave. MacArthur was a father of 2 and a tailor by trade who served in the Royal Engineers. The last of their 4-man crew was Joseph Moore as assistant keeper. The crew worked in shifts of 3, each man spending 2 weeks at the lighthouse and 2 weeks at the shore station in Briasclet on Lewis. Mor was on leave in December and due to be back to relieve one of his fellow keepers on Boxing Day. When he arrived on the Hesperus, he had no idea that no light had been seen coming from Eilean Mor in over a week. 11 days earlier, the SS Arctur had passed the Flannan Islands on its typical route between Philadelphia and Leith. The captain noticed the lighthouse was not in operation and noted the anomaly in his log. When the Northern Lighthouse Board was notified of the Arctur's report, the Hesperus was already en route to the island. It was eerily quiet when Joseph Moore entered the keeper's quarters at the lighthouse on December 26. The fireplace in the kitchen was cold and the clock was stopped. The beds were empty, but nothing was out of place. It simply looked as if the keepers had walked away. Moore ran back to the Hesperus to report what he'd discovered and was sent with 2 crew members to conduct a more thorough search. A slate board, used to note weather conditions and general notes to be recorded in the log later, was last updated on December 15th. The lamp had been cleaned and the oil fountains and canteens were filled. The pots and the pans from breakfast had been washed and the kitchen tidied. Only one set of oilskins and boots hung by the door. It appeared that the keepers had completed their morning duties on December the 15th, but what happened after was a complete mystery. Captain Harvey left Moore and 2 of his crew to attend the lighthouse and conduct a search of the island, while Hesperus returned to Briasclet to inform the Northern Lighthouse Board of the bizarre disappearance. The next day, a thoroughly terrified Moore and his colleagues ventured to the West Landing to look for clues. Like the landing where the Hesperus had berthed, the West Landing consisted of little more than a spit of beach and a long zigzagging stone staircase carved into the cliffside. A platform about halfway up the cliff housed the crane and ropes the keepers used to haul supplies up from the shore below. Here, Moore discovered the first evidence of what may have transpired on Eilean Mor that December. A box of parts and coils of ropes had been tossed across the rocks, snagged in crevices and tangled around the legs of the crane. The iron railings around the platform and near the steps had been pulled from the rock and twisted. A large block of stone weighing at least 1 ton had been dislodged from its position higher up on the cliffside and tossed down to the path. A lifebuoy fastened to the railings had been ripped away. The kind of damage observed at the West Landing was not man-made. Storms were not uncommon in the Flannans, and the small isles often bore the brunt of the most severe ones. But the damage extended 110 feet up the cliffside, as if a towering wave had crashed into the rock with godlike strength. It appeared as though the keepers had been washed away. Northern Lighthouse Board Superintendent Robert Muirhead, who arrived at Eilean Mor on December the 29th, agreed. In his report, he concluded, quote, "I am of the opinion that the most likely explanation of the disappearance of the men is that they had all gone down on the afternoon of Saturday, December the 15th, to the proximity of the West Landing to secure the box with the mooring ropes, etc., and that an unexpectedly large roller had come up on the island, and a large body of water going up higher than where they were and coming down upon them had swept them away with resistless force." End quote. With that, the matter was considered officially closed. A replacement crew was hired and the families of the lost men were told their loved ones had died in a terrible act of nature on Eilean Mor. However, many were unsatisfied with the official conclusion. There were too many loose ends. Most glaringly, it was strictly against the rules for all 3 keepers to be away from the lighthouse at once. If keepers had commandments, the first was, without question, "Thou shalt not leave thy light unattended." No matter what was unfolding around them, the keepers were expected to keep the light going at all costs. So, why had Ducat, MacArthur and Marshall all gone to the West Landing together? Then there was the matter of the oilskins still hanging by the door. It was determined that Marshall and Ducat's oilskins were missing, meaning they had been wearing them at the time of their disappearance. What could have compelled 3 keepers to eschew all rules and rush out into a storm with one leaving his oilskins behind? In the years after the strange disappearance, a magazine would publish what it claimed was the logbook from the Eilean Mor keepers in the days leading up to their disappearance. The entries, allegedly written by Marshall, spoke of terrible storms, despair, and Ducat and MacArthur praying and crying. Though most certainly a fabrication, the entries only fueled speculation that the true cause of the disappearance remained unknown. Many theorized that MacArthur, a man with a reputation for having a temper, had gone mad and thrown the other 2 keepers over the cliff before plunging to his own death. In another version, MacArthur had gone to the West Landing to jump, and Marshall and Ducat had tried to stop him, but had been pulled over or pushed from the edge by a gust of wind. Modern theories focus on meteorological factors rather than psychological ones. The coastline of Eilean Mor is indented with deep, narrow gullies called geos. The West Landing was situated in one such geo and terminated in a cave. In stormy weather or high seas, the water would rush into the cave, cause air compression, and then explode out again with enough force to sweep a man away. Many believe that MacArthur had been manning the light while Marshall and Ducat went to the landing to ensure the crane and equipment were properly secured. Marshall had received a fine for failing to do just that on a previous occasion and may have been anxious about the approaching weather. It's believed that MacArthur spotted large waves approaching the island and rushed to warn his colleagues, but was washed away too. This theory explains why he'd left his oilskins behind, but does not account for him taking the time to close the door and latch the gate. In 1900, waves towering above 100 feet were the stuff of rumours and legends. So rare, it was laughable to think one could have materialized near Eilean Mor. While the false logbook led many to believe the area was being hammered by fierce storms, there was no evidence at the time of such weather. But an Eilean Mor keeper in the 1950s took over 30 rolls of film to prove that such waves were possible, even common on the island. While the largest rogue wave ever officially recorded was just 58 feet tall, it's believed that such a wave, combined with the spray it could produce in the geo of West Landing, could reach the top of the cliff with such force 3 men could be swept away. Even with improved research, many believe that what unfolded on Eilean Mor in 1900 was supernatural in origin. Is it possible that the wild land believed to be a doorway between 2 worlds shook the interlopers from its shores? Later, there were rumours about subsequent lighthouse keepers at Eilean Mor hearing strange voices in the wind calling the names of the 3 dead men. Was it a warning, reminding the keepers they were not welcome? If so, the supernatural forces of Eilean Mor finally got their wish. The Flannan Lighthouse was automated in 1971, and the island is once again entirely uninhabited. A helipad was installed near the structure so maintenance workers can complete their tasks without venturing far from the shelter's walls. I wonder, Does the wind of Eilean Mor still call to them? Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a poem titled Flannan Isle about the occurrence at the lighthouse. It read in part, "Though 3 men dwell on Flannan Isle to keep the lamp alight, as we steered under the lee, we caught no glimmer through the night. A passing ship at dawn had brought the news, and quickly we set sail to find out what strange thing might ail the keepers of the deep sea light." Poems and rhymes have served as a way of preserving stories throughout history. In our next case, we explore just a few of them. Ring-a-ring-a roses, pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Chances are you've heard ring-a-ring-a roses, or ring around the rosy, as they say in the States, has ties to the Black Plague, or the Great Plague of 1655, which was responsible for the deaths of 15% of the population of London. But that claim has been widely debunked by both folklorists and historians. There is no evidence that the rhyme existed in English until the late 19th century, and the plague theory about its origins wasn't introduced until the 1960s. The more likely history can be traced to religious bans on dancing among many Protestants in the 19th century. Youth found a way around such bans by attending play parties that consisted of ring games, which differed from square dances only in their name and lack of musical accompaniment. The rings in the rhyme reference the circle in which the children are playing in, and the tumbling down references the jumble of bodies when the children let go of each other. As for ashes, that was likely a degradation of the phrase husher, husher, which referenced how the game fell silent at the rhyme's conclusion. Though this origin story is a 20th century myth, fear not, many nursery rhymes have no shortage of dark beginnings. Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, yes, sir. 3 bags full. 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, and 1 for the little boy who lives down the lane. The history behind this popular nursery rhyme becomes a bit easier to spot if we revert back to the original final line of the verse, which, up until the late 16th century, was "and none for the little boy who cries down the lane." The origins of Ba Ba Black Sheep can be traced to medieval England, where the wool trade was big business. The need for wool to produce cloth resulted in nearly everyone who owned land, from rural peasants to wealthy estate holders, raising flocks of sheep. Landowners, like lords, abbots, and bishops, even began to count their wealth in terms of how many sheep they owned, with some flocks totaling in the tens of thousands. The wool business was incredibly lucrative for all, at least for a while. After returning from the Crusades in 1272, King Edward I imposed new taxes on wool to pay for his military conquests. 1/3 of the price of each bag sold was allocated to the king or master. Another third was allocated to the monasteries and churches or the dame, which meant that only 1/3 of the revenue generated went to the landowner. As a result, most began paying the shepherds who tended their lucrative flocks a fraction of the wages they'd once earned. These shepherds, or little boys who cried down the lane, were left penniless. In the updated version of the rhyme, everyone walks away with a bag of wool. But in reality, the wool tax left many a shepherd destitute. Bar Bar Black Sheep isn't the only nursery rhyme whose roots reflect economic inequalities. Chances are you've heard of this one. Half a pound of tuppenny rice, half a pound of treacle, that's the way the money goes. Pop goes the weasel, up and down the city road, in and out the eagle, that's the way the money goes. Pop goes the weasel. There are two popular origin stories to this nursery rhyme, with the first being that it's about the Huguenot weavers who lived and worked in an area of East London called Spitalfields. They measured yarn on a spinner called a weasel, which made a popping noise when it measured the right amount. Because weaving was tiring, monotonous work, the weaver's mind wandered or went up and down the city road, with their daydreams interrupted by the pop of the weasel machine. But Pop Goes the Weasel is a nursery rhyme indigenous to London, and many believe it was written in Cockney rhyming slang. And if that's the case, the meaning of the rhyme changes dramatically. For those unfamiliar with Cockney rhyming slang, weasel refers to weasel and stoat, by which coat, and pop refers to pop shop, by which we would understand a pawn shop. So when the poorest of London are singing that rhyme, they are making reference to the tough economic conditions they're living under, by which they need to pawn their clothes to get some money. The Eagle might refer to the Eagle Tavern, a pub on the corner of City Road, where hard-working Londoners parted with their wages to forget their woes for a few hours. Whether the nursery rhyme refers to the daydreams of sweatshop workers or the pawning of a Sunday coat to buy food, the origins of this rhyme are far removed from the cheeky monkey chasing the weasel that most children are now familiar with. Britain is a very hilly and mountainous place, and the town of Kilmersdon claims to have a mound that inspired a very famous ditty. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. While some folklorists and historians have tied this rhyme's origin to a Norse legend and the rejection of a liquid tax using measurements called jacks and gills, Kilmersdon locals prefer a different origin story. According to local legend, the rhyme refers to a pair of secret lovers who snuck up the hill to meet. One day, Jack went up the hill to collect water when he was struck by a boulder dislodged from the nearby quarry. The stone hit Jack in the head, killing him. Jill, who was carrying a secret pregnancy, died in childbirth of a broken heart. Jack and Jill's son was then raised by the villagers of Kilmersdon. And while there's no proof that such a couple existed, the surname Gilson is still common in the area. Speaking of names, I'm sure you're very familiar with this next one. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. Some historians believe that this Mary may be Mary, Queen of Scots. The tragic heroine became queen at just 6 days of age in 1542 and ruled until 1567, when she was forced to abdicate her throne to her infant son. After 19 years as a prisoner of her cousin, Elizabeth I of England, Mary was executed after her own son secretly allied himself with Elizabeth. Proponents of the origin story believe that the cockle shells and silver bells were ornaments on a dress given to Mary by her first husband, the Dauphin of France. The pretty maids in a row may be a nod to the Queen's notorious ladies-in-waiting, known as the Four Marys. But many believe the Mary in this nursery rhyme is less tragic heroine and more, well, bloody. Mary I was Britain's first Queen Regent, or woman to rule the country as the primary monarch rather than simply the wife of a king. Mary gained the throne after the death of her half-brother, Edward VI. Unlike her father and predecessor, Mary was a Catholic. In an effort to maintain Protestant hold over the throne, the Lords of Somerset and Northumberland altered the line of succession to place Henry VII's niece, Lady Jane Grey, next in line to the throne. But Mary quickly gathered enough support to ride to London and claim the throne. For good measure, Jane Grey and her husband, Lord Dudley, were both executed. Mary's determination to restore English Catholicism didn't stop there. In 1554, she announced her intention to marry Prince Philip of Spain. The following year, she revived England's heresy laws and began burning Protestants at the stake, starting with Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Under Mary's 5-year rule, nearly 300 convicted heretics were burned and dozens more died in prison. Almost 1,000 fled to Germany and Switzerland. Despite her murderous rampage that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, Mary's campaign to convert the nation to Catholicism didn't last. After she died in 1558, Mary's Protestant half-sister Elizabeth became monarch. Those who believe Bloody Mary to be the inspiration for the now famous nursery rhyme think that contrary points to Mary's Catholic faith, as it was at odds with the general populace. As for the cockle shells, silver bells, and maidens in a row, they are not flowers or ornamentation, but tools of torture used to tend her garden. Silver bells were another term for thumbscrews, torture devices designed to crush victims' fingers until they confessed to their crimes. Cockle shells were even more heinous, as their use involved the mutilation of a victim's genitals. The pretty maids all in a row refers to the guillotine-like maiden execution instrument, likely a nod to Mary's mass execution of Protestants. In another jab at the bloody Queen, the rhyme's taunting question, "How does your garden grow?" refers to Mary's inability to produce a Catholic heir despite 2 supposed pregnancies. Poking fun at royals is quite common in nursery rhymes, like this one, which is believed to refer to King George IV. Georgie, porgy, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie, porgy ran away. Georgie was a tad heavy, weighing nearly 300 pounds and boasting a 50-inch waistline, hence the pudding and pie. When he was Prince Regent, George gained quite a reputation for his romantic romps, which resulted in a string of illegitimate children. When he was 23, he fell in love with Maria Anne Fitzherbert, had secretly married the Roman Catholic commoner. While Maria believed she was the prince's canonical and true wife, the marriage was never legally binding since George failed to gain his father's approval. But during his reign as king, George IV turned violently against her, claiming that she'd forced him into the secret marriage. Maria Fitzherbert wasn't the only girl Georgie kissed and then made cry. He despised his legitimate wife, Caroline of Brunswick, so much that he had her banned from his coronation ceremony. George married his cousin because he was in debt, and if he contracted a suitable marriage, Parliament would increase his allowance. The pair met for the first time just before their wedding, and each was disappointed in the match. George found Caroline unattractive and unhygienic, and Caroline found George to be nothing like his portrait and a drunk to boot. Somewhat miraculously, the couple did manage to parent a single child, Charlotte, and then quickly separated. Caroline showed up at George's coronation in 1821, hoping to obtain her crown, but was denied entrance and died shortly after. George was not remembered for his bravery or courage, but did enjoy bare-knuckle boxing. It's said that during one illegal prize fight, a boxer was knocked to the floor and died of his injuries. Terrified of being discovered at the scene, the prince quickly fled, leaving his future subjects to deal with the authorities on their own, and inspiring the final line of the nursery rhyme, "Georgie Porgy ran away." In the sing-song world of nursery rhymes, innocence often cloaks tales of intrigue, tragedy, and even political satire. While these rhymes have been cherished for generations, their origins often reveal a darker, more complex narrative. From the playful antics of Georgie Porgy masking a troubled royal life, to the ominous imagery of Mary, Mary, quite contrary, hinting at a bloody reign, each verse holds a hidden history waiting to be uncovered. So let us sing on and embrace both the light and shadows cast by these enduring nursery rhymes. Our following stories all feature people that either have or should have such rhymes made about their lives. We begin with the story of Daniel Lambert. Daniel Lambert was born on March the 13th, 1770 in the parish of St. Margaret, Leicester. His father, once a huntsman for the Earl of Stamford, was now the local jailer. While young Daniel did have an aunt and uncle on his father's side who were quite large, his mother and father were of average size, as were his siblings, a brother who died young, and two sisters who lived until adulthood. The young Lambert was raised in a sporting family and grew up strong and healthy, with a love for hunting, horse racing, fishing, and dogs. He was a terrific swimmer, to the extent that he was entrusted by local parents to teach the other children how to swim. Long before he was renowned for his impressive weight, Daniel was admired for his sheer strength and bravery. It's said that as a teenager he wandered across a performance of dancing bears while walking with one of his favorite dogs. The dog lunged at one of the bears, and the showman, irritated by the disruption, unmuzzled the great beast so it might do as it wished with the dog. Lambert beat the bear back with a pole and knocked it off its feet with a mighty wallop of his bare hand, frightening the beasts and the showman so much that they did not return to the area for several years. At 14, he was sent to Birmingham to train at the die-casting manufacturer Taylor & Co. The business was destroyed in the priestly riots of 1791, and unable to find other work, Daniel was sent back to Leicester. At 21, he took over his father's job as the local jailkeeper. For the first time in his life, Daniel was confined to a smaller indoor area, no longer spending his days strolling the fields, riding horses, or swimming in the local river. He began to put on weight. By 1793, he weighed 448 pounds, but remained remarkably strong and agile. He was known to still lift up to 560 pounds of timber and could carry 2 men on his back as he swam. His sheer size made him something of a local legend, and many visitors to Leicester stopped by the jail or the Lambert house to look at him. Despite his intimidating appearance, Lambert was a kind man. He took remarkable care of the prisoners in his charge, and it's claimed most left the jail with teary and heartfelt thanks to their jailer. But in the early 1800s, the prison was closed, and the prisoners were put to work in local manufacturing businesses instead. As a parting gift for his family's years of dedicated service, Daniel was awarded an annual annuity and a certificate of recognition. By this time, his weight was moving steadily closer to 600 pounds, and he found himself the object of fascination each time he left his home. And though the annuity provided some comfort, it was less than his annual income as a jailkeeper. Daniel had never particularly enjoyed the attention his weight brought, but he saw that it may provide him an opportunity to supplement his finances. In the spring of 1806, he commissioned the construction of a custom carriage large enough to accommodate his now 700-pound frame and moved to London. Once in the city, he settled into an apartment in Piccadilly and took an advertisement in the Times that read, "Exhibition. Mr. Daniel Lambert of Leicester, the greatest curiosity in the world, who, at the age of 36, weighs upwards of 50 stone, 14 pound to the stone. Mr. Lambert will see company at his house, number 53 Piccadilly, opposite St. James's Church, from 12 to 5 o'clock. Admittance, 1 shilling. And so for 5 hours each day, Daniel Lambert entertained visitors for 1 shilling apiece. This was no sideshow act or roadside gimmick. He simply sat and visited with his curious patrons. Those drawn in by their curiosity were astounded at his size, but they returned for his personality. Daniel was a sparkling conversationalist who could spend hours discussing dog breeds, hunting, or other outdoor interests. One banker in the city came so often to visit Daniel that he joked he had paid for at least a pound of the man's enormous weight. A group of 14 came all the way from Guernsey, crossing the English Channel for the sole purpose of seeing Lambert after hearing about him from their neighbours, and a Frenchman tried to convince him to accompany him back to France for a tour of the continent. One of Daniel's favourite visitors was Count Józef Borowski, the famous Polish-born dwarf and favourite of the European royals. Like Daniel, Borowski had submitted to being an object of curiosity out of financial necessity, and the two men found a strange kinship in their physical extremes. Lambert was also granted an audience with King George III, though the details of that meeting are, sadly, lost to history. Had Daniel Lambert lived 100 years later, his size would have been an object of mockery and ridicule. But in the early 19th century, Daniel was treated as a marvel, and many people from London's middle and upper classes sought out his companionship, if only to be included in the sphere of his endearing personality. Along with his fashionable visitors, Lambert also attracted the attention of London's medical professionals, eager to examine the heaviest man in recorded history. An article in the Medical and Physical Journal confirmed that Daniel weighed 50 stones and measured 5 feet 11 inches tall. He was described as mentally alert, well-read, and with an excellent memory. He appeared to be in excellent health and told physicians he could walk at least 1/4 mile without difficulty. Doctors found tumefaction, now known as edema or fluid retention, in his feet, legs and thighs, but reported that his normal speaking voice showed no signs of pressure on the lungs. Lambert claimed to eat normal quantities of ordinary food and said he had drank nothing but water for the past decade. Though Daniel enjoyed a certain degree of respect and admiration, not all his visitors were polite. He disdained the constant questions about the size and cost of his clothing, finding the inquiry overly personal and rude. One man claimed that he had a right to know about it since his shilling entrance fee was paying for said clothing. A frustrated Daniel replied, "Sir, if I knew what part of my next coat your shilling would pay for, I can assure you I would cut out the piece." He had little patience for rudeness and was known to turn visitors out as quickly as they entered if they were uncivil. After 5 months of entertaining up to 400 visitors daily, Daniel's pockets were bulging with coin and he was ready to return home. Back in Leicester, he resumed his lifelong passions, now as a very wealthy man. He was a skilled dog breeder, and the list to purchase a sporting dog from Lambert's line was long. He was now a bona fide celebrity, and even an outing to attend the races earned a mention in the local news, which read, "Among the distinguished characters upon the turf, we are glad to see our old friend Mr. Daniel Lambert, in apparent high health and spirits." Though Daniel had grown dispirited in London, the public was more eager than ever to see the man of mythical proportions. So after an enjoyable reprieve, he began touring around the country, attracting massive crowds wherever he appeared. By 1809, Daniel weighed 739 pounds and could no longer climb stairs. Many would later theorize that his summer tour that year would be his last, a final push that would earn him enough money to retire for good. He arranged for his tour to conclude in Stamford, Lincolnshire, so that he might view the Stamford races before returning home. He arrived on June the 20th, taking a ground floor room at the Wagon and Horses Inn on High Street. He took a meeting with a printer from the Stamford Mercury to arrange an order of advertisements and handbills and went to bed early. The following day, he rose at his usual time in apparently good health, but began to complain of shortness of breath while shaving. Minutes later, the mountain of a man collapsed to the floor and died. He was 39 years old. Daniel Lambert's death was undeniably sad, but those who attended him had more pressing worries. The massive corpse began to putrefy quickly in the warm summer air, and there was no chance of moving him to Leicester. A window and part of a wall were disassembled so Daniel's body could be removed from the inn, and a massive elm coffin measuring over 4 feet wide was made for his burial. The carriage-sized box, made of 156 square feet of wood, was constructed on wheels. On June the 23rd, 20 men rolled the casket from town to a burial ground in St. Martin's, and it's claimed it took nearly half an hour to lower the box down a gradual slope into the grave. Though buried some 30 miles from his home, Daniel Lambert was not given a pauper's funeral. Dozens of people gathered at the churchyard, many of whom had expected to see Daniel alive at the final stop of his tour. His tombstone, paid for by his many friends and admirers, read, "In remembrance of that prodigy in nature, Daniel Lambert, a native of Leicester, who was possessed of an exalted and convivial mind, and in personal greatness had no competitor. He measured 3 foot 1 inch round the leg, 9 feet 4 inches around the body, and weighed 52 stone 11 pounds. He departed this life on June the 21st, 1809, aged 39 years. As a testimony of respect, this stone is erected by his friends in Leicester." Daniel Lambert was not easily forgotten. Months after his death, John Draycard released the first full biography of his life. Pubs across England were renamed in his honour, and his clothes and possessions were sold at auction. The term Daniel Lambert became part of common English speech as a reference to any overweight man, and eventually to anything exceptionally large. A life-size waxwork of Lambert was shown in the United States and later bought by showman P.T. Barnum for display at his New York museum. Barnum visited Stamford several times to use Lambert's belongings in publicity stunts. During one visit, the 40-inch tall Charles Sherwood Stratton, better known as General Tom Thumb, was tied up inside one of Lambert's stockings. In 1866, Barnum brought 4 dwarfs to Stamford to pass through the knee of Daniel Lambert's breeches side by side. It remains unknown what may have caused his extreme weight, since no autopsy was conducted before his burial, and there are no records that indicate he had exhibited symptoms common to endocrine or genetic disorders. Daniel Lambert's title as world's heaviest man didn't outlive him for long. American Mills Darden topped the scales at over 1,000 pounds in the 1850s. Today, the title is still held by John Brower Minnock, a taxi driver from Seattle, Washington, who was recorded as weighing 1,400 pounds in 1978. But Daniel certainly remains Leicester's favourite rotund raconteur. A set of his clothes, along with his armchair, walking stick and prayer book, are on permanent display at the Newark Houses Museum, and in Stamford, the local football team is nicknamed the Daniels after their folk hero. To those who knew him or are familiar with his story, Daniel's massive imprint on local history comes not simply from his size, but his pleasant disposition. Next up, we have the tale of Helen Duncan, one of the last women to be charged under the Witchcraft Act, midway through World War II. Helen Duncan was born Victoria Helen McCrae McFarlane in Callander, Perthshire, Scotland, on November the 25th, 1897. She came from a working-class family and was one of 8 children of builder and slater Archibald McFarlane and his wife Isabella. As a small child, Helen earned the nickname Hellish Nell for her tomboyish way of behaving, her occasional hysterical outbursts and sinister predictions. Indeed, her youth is filled with stories of strange events, from her hearing disembodied voices, receiving warnings about friends and loved ones, and seemingly passing out while sitting a test in school, only to come round to find her work finished and all questions answered correctly. All this much to the chagrin of her devoutly Presbyterian mother. As a teenager, Helen started working in Dundee, first in a jute mill and later as a nurse. She had decided to turn her hand to nursing after suffering a bout of tuberculosis. After receiving care in a sanatorium, she felt that her future lay with caring for others. She would eventually meet with First World War veteran Henry Duncan after he was sent home from the army after suffering rheumatic fever. There are claims that each had seen a vision of the other before they had met, with Helen stating she was told he would be the man she marries. On May 27, 1919, that is exactly what happened. Henry then began working for a cabinet maker and, while not without their struggles, life seemed to be going well. But as is often the case, tragedy was lurking around the corner. At just 13 months old, the couple's third child, Henrietta, sadly died of pneumonia. This sent both parents into a deep depression, eventually resulting in Henry suffering a heart attack. Thankfully, he survived, but was left too weak to work. This heaped pressure on Helen, who had to juggle working in a bleach factory while caring for her husband and growing family. As the years passed, she had not neglected her supposed powers and was now hosting weekly meetings and seances with friends and others who claimed to have paranormal capabilities. Each sitting would start with the group saying a prayer or reading from the Bible after a previous attempt to summon spirits apparently led to a fireplace being destroyed when a not-so-friendly spirit came through. Often during these seances, it's claimed that the spirit of a Dr. Williams would instruct Helen and her husband on ways to improve her connection with the spirit world. These included fastening a curtain across one corner of the room and using a red light and trumpet to increase the volume of the spirit's voice and help in producing physical manifestations. Eventually, Dr. Williams was replaced by another spirit, Donald, who instructed those present to begin inviting others to the meetings. As word of Helen's seances grew, she quickly came to the attention of the London Psychic Centre, home of the Psychic Union. After undergoing a series of tests, she was awarded a diploma, and as a newly certified medium, she visited many of the Union's churches up and down the country. It was during this period that Helen had her first brush with the law, when she was charged with fraud after a woman apparently caught her trying to hide a ball of material under her clothes. She believed this would then be used to produce a supposed manifestation. Her trial began in Edinburgh on May 3rd, 1933, and lasted several days. While some sources state that it eventually ended in a verdict of not proven, with Helen simply being fined £10 for swearing, newspapers from the time state that she was in fact found guilty of fraud, with the fine being in place of spending a week in prison. Whatever the verdict may have been, the news coverage only served to grow the demand for Helen's services. The Second World War brought many visits from anxious relatives, especially those who had lost close family during the conflict. One phenomenon or trick, depending on your point of view, that Helen was famous for was producing ectoplasm. This very curious and shocking practice took place during her medium sessions. Duncan would enter a trance-like state, and it was claimed a paranormal substance known as ectoplasm would emanate from her body, often from her mouth or nose. These expulsions would often form figures, sometimes even with faces. Though she was a major proponent of the practice, Duncan wasn't the only medium that displayed this bizarre talent. Quote, "In the early 20th century, spiritualist photography took a curious turn. Suddenly, mediums were photographed grappling with strange fibrous materials that emerged from their mouths, noses, and ears, or twisted out from corners like writhing tentacles." Unquote. The practice was eventually proven to be faked, with people managing to take snippets of the material to be tested in laboratory analysis. There, it was revealed as being created using a mixture of cheesecloth, egg whites, and various chemicals to fake the appearance of a supposed ethereal being. These tricks and practices may all seem very silly looking back at the photographs from that time. But remember that this was happening nearly 100 years ago, and her clients were often grief-stricken people who were so affected by the death of a loved one that they simply did not care. Sometimes, needing to cope with the loss will make you do things you wouldn't normally do and believe people who may not be trustworthy. While the ectoplasm phenomenon may be easily dismissed, one of Helen's psychic predictions proved more difficult to discredit. In fact, the details of her presage were so specific and involved something so secret that it would bring her practices to the attention of the British Navy. In November 1941, Helen Duncan held a séance in Portsmouth, England, where she reportedly made several accurate statements regarding a naval disaster. The sinking of the HMS Barham, a British battleship, was top secret at the time due to wartime censorship. However, Duncan apparently described the sinking in detail, including the fact that the ship had been hit by 3 torpedoes before it exploded. These details were apparently passed to her from a sailor who had died in the attack, whose mother was present during the séance. In the book, The Two Worlds of Helen Duncan, written in part by one of Helen's daughters, it stated that the mother of the sailor confronted naval authorities, who then began looking into Helen's practices. It's believed that they were concerned that Duncan might have obtained classified information through espionage rather than through supernatural means. During another séance in 1944, 2 naval officers were in attendance when Helen stated that a figure claimed to be one of the officers, Lieutenant Worth's dead aunt. Another claimed to be his deceased sister, but he had no dead aunt or sister and was disgusted by what he had seen and heard. Worth then reported the events to the police. On January 19, 1944, Helen Duncan was arrested and initially charged under the Vagrancy Act, but this would later be changed to a charge of fraudulent spiritual activity under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Between the 16th and 18th centuries in Scotland, the public and rulers of those times, such as King James VI, became increasingly concerned about magical practices and people dealing with malevolent forces. The Witchcraft Act of 1563 made witchcraft practices, or even consulting with so-called witches, punishable as capital offences. This had a strong impact on society for the next couple of centuries. Many people took advantage of this law for their own gain. It was estimated that nearly 4,000 people were tried for witchcraft during this time, with some 2,500 of them being executed between 1563 and 1727. The majority of those who were killed, over 80%, were women and most likely innocent. In 1735, a new Witchcraft Act was passed which made it a crime to claim a person had magical powers or were guilty of practicing witchcraft. This was a near complete reversal of the 1563 Act and reflected a wider move away from witch trials and executions. The last execution for witchcraft having taken place just a few years earlier in 1727. So, in actuality, Helen Duncan wasn't charged with being a witch, but with claiming to have magical powers, fraudulent witchcraft. This detail did nothing to quell the public and media outrage that would ensue. The UK, like much of the rest of the world, had witnessed many shocking and tragic occurrences during the war, and now the mention of witchcraft was thrown into the mixer. Despite the public outcry and Duncan offering to demonstrate her supposed abilities to the court, on April 3, 1944, she was found guilty of contravening the Witchcraft Act of 1735 and sentenced to 9 months in prison. After the verdict was read, she cried out, "I didn't do anything. Oh God, is there a God?" While it's believed that her trial and imprisonment were somehow orchestrated by the government and/or military who feared she could reveal more secrets, days after the trial, Winston Churchill wrote a letter to the Home Secretary stating he believed that the whole debacle had been a waste of resources. He went on to describe the charges as obsolete tomfoolery. Despite this, Helen Duncan would not be the last to stand trial under the Witchcraft Act. Later that same year, in September of 1944, a 72-year-old woman named Jane York from Forest Gate, East London, was charged under the same act. She faced 7 counts of pretending to conjure up spirits of the dead. Her punishment was simply to pay £5 and be of good behaviour for 3 years. As for Helen, though an appeal saw nearly 40 witnesses testify, that what they saw at the seances had convinced them of life after death, it was ultimately rejected, and she would serve out her entire sentence, being released in 1945. Though she promised never to hold a seance again, she was arrested for doing so in 1956. There would be no threat of a second trial under the Witchcraft Act, as it's theorised, in no small part due to the negative reaction to her initial trial. The Act had since been repealed and replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. The repeal of this Witchcraft Act was part of broader legal reforms and reflected changing attitudes towards superstition and belief in the supernatural. This did not, of course, mean there was a definitive end to beliefs in witchcraft or occult practices, but it did mark a significant shift in how these beliefs were viewed in the law. It was a recognition of the increasing secularization of society and a move towards more rationalistic approaches to law and justice. As she awaited charges under this new law, Helen Duncan passed away on December 6, 1956. Her supporters claim this was due to ectoplasm violently receding into her body after the police, knocking at the door, disturbed her while she was in a trance. Helen's legacy is a complex one that still causes discussion and controversy to this day. The spiritualist is still used as an example of a famous fraudulent medium. However, there are also still some people who believe that her powers were real. Whichever side of the debate you land on, it does seem like her services did relieve some anxiety and bring a form of closure to a number of people who lost members of their family in the war. In an age where treating mental health was uncommon, she managed to bring them a kind of peace. However, many would still say that she actually took advantage of those who were in mourning and gave false hope to people who wanted proof that there was something tangible out there after death. A bust created in her honour was presented to her hometown of Callander in Scotland, but backlash from those with strong religious views who objected to its public display led to it being moved to a museum in nearby Stirling. Despite her detractors, there has been an ongoing campaign to pardon Helen. In 2008, the Scottish Parliament rejected a petition for this to happen. There were controversies around the reasons for which she was convicted, with people saying that the reasons were mostly political. A website set up by the Helen Duncan Foundation, part of the International Society for Scientific Mediumship and Parapsychological Investigation, states they don't want a pardon. Instead, they want those who they believe wrongly convicted her to apologize and admit she was a remarkable medium who served the people. But what do you believe? Do you think that it's possible for people to converse with the dead? I mean, how could she have known about the sinking of the HMS Barham? Several answers to the latter question have been posited over the years. One theory states that while the sinking wasn't public knowledge, many family members received letters of condolence asking them to keep the sinking secret until the official announcement. Others point to a professor who had been told about the sinking and believed it had already been revealed to the public. Wherever you stand on the controversial issue of mediumship, the case of Helen Duncan is a notable chapter in Britain's legal history, and again shines a light on how primarily women have faced persecution over the years for being witches and for not being witches. Another woman who led an intriguing life, though with a tragic end, was Elizabeth Tabor, better known as Baby Doe. Baby Doe was born Elizabeth Lizzie McCourt in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, sometime in the 1850s. She was the fifth child in a string of 13 to Irish Catholic immigrant parents. Lizzie's father ran a local clothing store and owned a theatre, the first of its kind in Oshkosh. The McCourt family enjoyed a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle until a series of fires burned down both their home and places of business, leaving them impoverished. Lizzie had long been prized for her striking beauty, and she used it to her advantage when she entered a local skating contest wearing a costume that allowed a glimpse of her bare legs, a daring choice for the time. But it captured the attention of Harvey Doe Jr., the local mayor's son. Much to his mother's displeasure, Irish Catholic Lizzie married the Protestant Harvey in 1877 and travelled west with him to look after his family's mining investments. The newlyweds settled in Central City, Colorado, where Harvey owned half of the 4th of July mine. Lizzie was enchanted by the rugged beauty of the mountains, and those she encountered there were charmed by her beauty and easy, flirtatious manner, which earned her the nickname Baby Doe. Harvey proved less capable than Baby Doe had imagined and struggled to manage the mine, having little success. But Baby Doe was determined to make their venture prosperous and provide for her family in Oshkosh, so she became one of the first women to take to the mine herself, donning men's clothing and a pickaxe and disappearing into the earth for hours at a time. While the first gold had been discovered through the relatively simple act of sifting rocks and sand through a pan, the venture had become much more laborious by the time the Does arrived in Colorado. The veins of gold had been traced from riverbeds deep into the rock, where miners toiled in pitch-black shafts, chasing the ever-dwindling gleam of fortune. Harvey, who had been raised in a world of comfort and ease, quickly became disenchanted with the mine and turned his attention to women and drinking. The pair limped along unhappily for a while, moving from dwelling to dwelling, before Harvey abandoned Baby Doe after she gave birth to a stillborn son. Undaunted, Baby Doe tracked her husband to Denver and was able to obtain a divorce when she caught him in the act with a local sex worker. She then followed a friend to Leadville to work at a haberdashery. At the time, Leadville was Colorado's second largest city, full of banks, saloons, and mining money. And no one had more mining money than Horace Tabor, who noticed Baby Doe's beauty and charm almost immediately. Horace Tabor grew up on a family farm in rural Vermont, but joined the wave of pioneers west in 1855. While he found little success farming in Kansas territory, his firm stance against slavery saw him elected to Topeka's Free Soil Alternative Legislature, and he was able to marry his sweetheart Augusta Pierce and move her to Kansas. After a few years of hard living, the couple followed the gold rush further west in 1859. Horace and Augusta settled in modern-day Golden, Colorado, and had a son named Maxie. Horace tried his hand at prospecting while Augusta baked, took in laundry, and managed their small boarding house to keep the family afloat. Horace found a few decent claims, but never the kind of gold nuggets he dreamed of. Eventually, the Tabors opened a store and post office to supply local miners, while Horace continued to dabble in local politics. Through their industrious hard work, the Tabors became solidly prosperous and well respected in their community. But Horace hadn't dreamed of running a post office and found it hard to ignore the pool of sudden fortune. So when the silver rush pushed deep into the Rockies, he followed, becoming one of 4 commissioners who set up a new town. He was elected mayor and named the settlement Leadville. But his big break came the following year, in 1878, when he funded 2 miners, providing them with supplies in exchange for a third of whatever they discovered. The miners hit one of the biggest silver veins in the area, making Horace rich overnight. Soon, he'd purchased additional mines including the prosperous Matchless Mine, which produced over $11 million of silver during the years he owned it. With his newfound wealth, Tabor bankrolled a growing political career, winning the race for Lieutenant Governor of Colorado. He also established the Bank of Leadville and helped to build an opera house and hotel. Augusta Tabor, a refined New Englander, loathed the limelight and struggled to find the happiness in their newfound fortune that came so easily to Horace. Her husband spent his money freely on drinking, gambling, and women, while Augusta endured an increasing discomfort. In 1880, she quietly moved to Denver to distance herself from her husband. Baby Doe had heard rumors about the man who owned most of Leadville and his sharp-tongued, nagging wife, and the pair met in a Leadville restaurant around the time Augusta moved to Denver. The pair quickly began a whirlwind romance. 49-year-old Horace was eager to woo the beautiful 25-year-old Baby Doe and moved her into a luxurious hotel suite after paying off all her debts. Once it was clear the couple were madly in love, Horace moved Baby Doe to the newly constructed Windsor Hotel in Denver, while he moved out of the home he had shared with Augusta and tried to convince her to agree to a divorce. After 2 years of trading insults with his wife, who steadfastly refused to end their union, Tabor sought a secret divorce in Durango. He and Baby Doe married in a legally questionable private ceremony in St. Louis, Missouri, in September 1882. The following year, Augusta sued Horace and finally settled for a legal divorce after he agreed to compensate her with real estate and stock in his mines. Augusta would invest her assets wisely, becoming one of the wealthiest women in Denver and supporting several charitable causes before dying of pneumonia in Pasadena, California at 62. Horace Tabor lost the race for a U.S. Senate seat, but was appointed to finish Henry Teller's term when he was appointed Secretary of the Interior. During their short stint in Washington, Horace and Baby Doe married for a second time in a lavish public celebration attended by President Chester A. Arthur. Baby Doe wore a dress spun with real silver worth $7,000, the equivalent of over $200,000 today. The plunging neckline of the dress showed off Baby's diamond wedding necklace, rumored to have contained a jewel that Queen Isabella of Spain had sold to finance Christopher Columbus's expedition. The couple's nuptials made national headlines, but did not earn Baby Doe a place in respected society. Though fabulously wealthy, the newlyweds could not buy the approval of Augusta's staunch supporters or those who believed their May-December romance and double divorces were too scandalous for polite society. Once back in Denver, Baby Doe filled her time with shopping, beauty appointments, and her scrapbooking hobby, receiving no visits or invitations from the city's elite. She was generous with her money and provided free offices to the Colorado suffragette movement, despite their repeated social snubs from many of its members. In 1884, Baby gave birth to the first of her and Horace's two daughters, Elizabeth Bondule Lily Tabor. Lily was christened in a $15,000 gown, and her diapers were fastened with an $800 diamond solitaire pin. At 3 years old, the fabulously wealthy Tot was featured on the front cover of Harper's Bazaar. By all accounts, her mother was loving and doting, choosing to remain home instead of accompanying Horace on his never-ending business trips. After a stillborn son, the Tabors welcomed a second daughter, Rosemary Echo Silver Dollar Tabor, in 1889. By then, the Tabors were living in an opulent mansion the size of a city block on Denver's Capitol Hill. Though she was not welcomed into society, Baby Doe Tabor was certainly known to all, and there was no denying that the sight of her dripping in diamonds and flying through the streets in her private carriage while nursing Silver Dollar was eye-catching, to say the least. It was hard to believe that she had once wielded a pickaxe in a mine wearing grubby coveralls. In 1890, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was enacted in response to growing complaints from miners and farmers when the price of silver dipped. The Act increased the amount of silver the government was required to purchase to back its currency. The law required that the Treasury buy the silver with special issue notes that could be redeemed for silver or gold. As a result, the volume of circulating currency expanded substantially without a proportionate growth in gold stock. Horace had already been forced to mortgage several of his real estate holdings when the price of silver declined. But the 59er who waited nearly 2 decades to strike it rich once wasn't eager to give up his stakes in the metal that made him wealthy. He borrowed against his other assets to hold on to his mines, hoping that silver prices would rise again. But by 1893, the statutory limit of the minimum amount of gold in federal reserves was reached when people tried to redeem their silver notes for gold as the price of silver continued to plummet, sparking the Panic of 1893. President Grover Cleveland summoned an emergency session of Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and Horace Tabor's mining fortune disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Ever undaunted, Baby Doe immediately pitched in to help pay her husband's massive debts. She sold her jewellery and opera gowns and ran Tabor's businesses while he was out of town. When the electricity in their mansion was turned off, she turned it into a game for Lily and Silver Dollar to keep their spirits high. Through it all, Baby Doe remained enamored with her husband. Unlike Harvey Doe, Horace Tabor was no slouch. At age 65, he mounted a search for gold in South America while the family's home and contents were sold, and the four Tabors moved into a one-room apartment in a boarding house. Horace's friends took pity on the once great businessman and rallied to arrange his appointment to the postmaster of Denver in 1898. During his heyday, Tabor had donated an entire city block for a post office. It was this massive establishment that the defunct millionaire presided over, spending his final days exactly as he had started, running a post office. But just 15 months into his new appointment, which provided a modest salary and allowed the family to live in a simple room at the Windsor Hotel, Horace Tabor died. It's rumoured that Horace believed in his silver mines until the very end, telling Baby Doe as he lay on his deathbed to hold on to the matchless mine. It will make millions again when silver comes back. When the last of Horace's money had run out, Doe followed his advice and took her 2 children to Leadville, where she tried for several years to find investors to bring the matchless mine back into production. It's unclear if the Tabors even owned the mine at the time, but Baby Doe, still only in her mid-40s with children, was determined to claw her way back to success. She even tried to work the mine herself, but soon discovered that its shafts were flooded and the conditions deplorable. Lily Tabor left Colorado as a teen to live with relatives in Wisconsin, unable to adjust to her new life of poverty. Following Lily's departure, Baby Doe and Silver Dollar moved into a shack on the site of the matchless mine. The single-room dwelling was a former tool shed, woefully inadequate for human habitation in Colorado's harsh winters. Once old enough, Silver Dollar attempted to earn a living as a writer and entertainer in Denver, sending her mother whatever she could spare from her paltry earnings. After earning a less than stellar reputation for her drunken antics, Silver Dollar sought a fresh start in Chicago, where she tried to make a name for herself in theatre, calling herself Ruth Norman. In 1925, she was discovered dead in her Ellis Avenue apartment, either from suicide or a terrible accident after she spilled a pot of boiling water on herself. Baby Doe never believed that the woman living as Ruth Norman was her daughter and held on to the hope that Silver Dollar was still alive, living in a convent. Alone and destitute, she continued living in the shack at Matchless Mine, eating only stale bread and suet, but refusing to accept charity. She leaned heavily on her religion and began to believe that her life of great wealth was a period of vanity for which she must pay penance. She wrote prolifically in her later life, keeping diaries, writing letters, and recording random insights she called dreams and visions. She pored over her scrapbooks, reliving her happy years with Horace and her daughters. In the winter months, Baby Doe wrapped burlap sacks around her legs, and she was often seen wandering Leadville wearing a mix of men's and women's clothing, most of it torn and dirty. Even in her poverty, many refused to forgive her for her past transgressions. They believed she deserved to suffer for causing the breakup of Horace and Augusta, even though she and Horace were clearly very in love for their entire marriage. Many referred to Baby Doe as the local madwoman. In reality, she was likely just very lonely, having been purposefully excluded from society and then left by herself when her family died and departed. A Leadville native later said she saw Baby Doe at the post office every day, leaning against the radiator for warmth and waiting for a letter from Silver Dollar. While she had enjoyed just over a decade of extreme wealth and luxury, she lived for over 30 years in squalor and hunger. After a particularly severe snowstorm in the winter of 1935, neighbors noticed that no smoke had been seen coming out of the chimney of the Matchless Mine cabin for several days. When they investigated, they discovered Baby Doe Tabor dead and frozen on the floor of the shack. The 81-year-old had died of either a heart attack or exposure, utterly alone and penniless beside the mine that she'd promised Horace to look after. For one final time, she graced the front pages of the newspapers across the country. Her remaining possessions were auctioned off for a paltry $700, and Baby Doe was buried beside Horace in Mount Olivet Cemetery near Denver. Unappreciated in her own time, Baby Doe Tabor has grown into a larger-than-life figure in Colorado history. In the years since her death, she has moved far beyond the superficial caricature of a gold digger and is now remembered for her brave, if unconventional, life choices. Baby Doe was a woman who was unafraid to roll up her sleeves, pull on her coveralls, and sink below the earth to toil in the mines. She was equally unafraid to leave an unhappy marriage during a time when few would dare to divorce. She pursued the man she loved, unafraid of scandal, society, or scorn. And when the love of her life died, leaving her destitute, she did not seek refuge in another marriage. Instead, she chose to live on her terms and, if not comfortable, was at least entirely in control of her circumstances. Baby Doe's remarkable life story has been portrayed in a Hollywood film, immortalized in opera, and used as inspiration for a string of Western-themed restaurants called Baby Doe's Matchless Mine. She was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame in 1985. And several Colorado sites, including Matchless Mine, share her story with visitors each year. Her possessions and writings eventually made their way to the Colorado Historical Society and have been lovingly cared for and studied. After her mother died, Lily Tabor began to deny any relation to her. Perhaps she was ashamed that the woman who'd once pinned her diapers on with diamonds had died alone and impoverished. But despite her denial, Lily Tabor could not prevent Colorado from loudly and proudly claiming Baby Doe as one of its most beloved mothers. Our next story takes us to Georgian Britain and an escapist who would make his mark down under, gaining the moniker Moondyne Joe. For nearly 2 decades, a convict known as Moondyne Joe thwarted British authorities in Western Australia again and again. The man seemed capable of escaping from any prison, no matter how fortified or well guarded, and was capable of melting into the wild Australian bush for months or years at a time. His remarkable escapades made him the best-known bushranger in the region and a folk hero who now has an annual festival named in his honour. On the first Sunday of May each year, locals and visitors in the town of Tujay or Tuji participate in reenactment, tours of an old prison cell, and mock trials. The event attracts between 5,000 and 10,000 festival goers each year, all eager to celebrate the life of a particularly persistent convict. But long before he was the stuff of Australian legend, Moondyne Joe was a British miner named Joseph Belitho Johns, whose story began with bread and bacon. Johns was working as an iron ore miner in Wales in 1848 when he and an associate named John Williams were stopped by a police sergeant who found the men's presence on an open road at 2:30 a.m. a tad suspicious. It was discovered that Johns and his companion had stolen from a house nearby. Not money or valuables, but some cheese, 3 loaves of bread, 2 pieces of bacon, some mutton, and a piece of suet. Such a crime would usually be punished by only a few weeks in prison, but both men refused to admit their guilt. A frustrated judge, hell-bent on teaching the petty thieves a lesson, instead sentenced the pair to 10 years of penal servitude. After serving parts of his sentence in several prisons and prison hulks in the UK, Johns was transferred to the Pyrenees, a ship bound for what was then the British penal colony of Western Australia. His accomplice, Williams, had been sent to Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, the year prior. The Pyrenees set sail in February of 1853, arriving at Fremantle on April 30th. As he stepped from the ship, Johns held in his hand a ticket of leave granted to prisoners who displayed good behaviour. The ticket allowed him to find employment, purchase land, and even bring family members across if he wished. In many ways, he was now free, except he could not carry firearms, board a ship, or leave the area without permission. Once Johns completed half his sentence under these conditions, he was entitled to a conditional pardon that removed all restrictions save one, the right to leave the colony. On paper, these conditions seemed much better than what he may have endured in England, but in reality his transportation was a life sentence. The social stigma remained with convicts throughout their lives. They rarely married into settler families, and obtaining paid work other than unskilled manual labour was difficult. Still, Johns completed his probation and was freed and conditionally pardoned in 1855. He then settled in the Avon Valley west of Tujay. The Aboriginal name for the rugged area was Moondyne, and it was there that Johns settled into his new occupation of stock trapping. Johns erected a series of gates and fences near Moondyne Springs to capture escaped horses and livestock. Upon returning the creatures to their owners, he was often granted a reward, and for several years he managed to avoid trouble, carving out a meagre existence through stock trapping and other odd jobs. Then, in 1861, Johns caught an unbranded stallion, likely a Brumby, a free-roaming wild horse. Johns branded the horse with his own mark and was arrested for horse stealing. He was jailed in the Newcastle convict hiring depot. This dilapidated and underprotected lockup was mostly vacant since there had been no new convict arrivals in the colony the year prior. Fancying his chances, Joe escaped in the night, taking the Brumby with him, which had been brought along as evidence for his trial. To add insult to injury, he also stole the magistrate's new saddle and bridle. The escapee was on the run for 2 days before he was tracked down and rearrested, by which time he had killed the Brumby and removed his brand from its hide, destroying the evidence of his thievery, which carried a sentence of 10 years. Instead, he was sentenced to 3 years of penal servitude for the lesser charge of prison breaking and transferred to the convict establishment at Fremantle. There, Johns bided his time, with good behaviour earning him a second certificate of freedom in 1864. But in January 1865, an ox named Bright was killed, with Joe being accused of killing the beast and sentenced to another decade of penal servitude. He maintained his innocence of the crime during the trial and would continue to insist on it for the rest of his life. While Johns had humbly served his time for his prison escape, he could not abide this miscarriage of justice. He escaped with a fellow prisoner from a work party, and the duo remained on the run for a month, committing small robberies along the way. Joe was finally recaptured 23 miles, 37 kilometres east of York, and sentenced to 12 months in irons for the escape. In July of 1866, he received another 6 months for trying to cut the lock out of his door. In August, he escaped again, cut off his irons, and met up with 3 other escaped convicts near Perth. When the newspapers ran the story about his escape, they dubbed him Moondyne Joe, a nickname that remained with him for the rest of his life. While roaming the bush near Perth, Moondyne Joe hatched a plan to escape to South Australia by travelling overland. On September the 5th, he and his gang broke into a store in Tooje, stealing boots, blankets, guns, ammunition, knives and rations to equip themselves for the arduous trek. They travelled east, making it nearly 200 miles, before they were recaptured near present-day Westonia. Joe received 5 years of hard labour on top of his existing sentence and was returned to Fremantle Prison, where a custom escape-proof cell was prepared for him. The room was reinforced with jarrah wood panelling and long nails to prevent the convict from digging his way out. 3 layers of bars were put on the window, making it nearly pitch black even at midday. For good measure, Joe was handcuffed, wore leg irons, and was shackled to an iron ring in the centre of the cell's floor. Western Australia's Governor, John Hampton, inspected the cell himself and was so pleased with its fortifications that he told Moondyne Joe, "If you get out again, I'll forgive you." After several months of this severe confinement in the darkened room, Joe's health began to deteriorate. On the advice of the prison doctor, he was set to work breaking stone in a corner of the prison yard under constant supervision. The rock broken by Joe was not removed by his guards at the end of each day, as was procedure, and before long the pile grew until it obscured him from the waist down as he worked. Unseen, he would occasionally swing his hammer at the limestone wall of the prison instead of the rocks. On March the 7th, 1867, Moondyne Joe escaped through a hole in the prison wall and fled into the bush. Despite a massive manhunt, he was not recaptured for nearly 2 years. On February 25th, 1869, Joe broke into Horton's vineyard in the Swan Valley to steal supplies. Unbeknownst to him, the local police were investigating a drowning nearby with the help of the vineyard's owner. When the owner returned and Joe made a dash past him and escape, he found himself and a group of police officers who'd come to the cellars for a drink. Moondyne was promptly returned to prison and sentenced to an additional 12 months in irons for escaping and 3 years for breaking and entering. But Joe had remembered John Hampton's promise and petitioned the new governor, Frederick Weld, to uphold it. Amazingly, Joe was released in 1871 and gained a conditional pardon in 1873. After his release, Joe worked various jobs across the colony and married a young widow named Louisa Hearn. He remained something of a scoundrel for the rest of his days, committing minor offences but avoiding imprisonment. Moondyne Joe was well into his 70s in 1900 when he was found wandering the streets of South Perth, taken into custody for being of unsound mind and ordered to the Mount Eliza Invalid Depot for care. Perhaps unsurprisingly, despite his age, he escaped 3 times, likely believing he was imprisoned once again. He died at the Fremantle Lunatic Asylum on August 13, 1900, making his final great escape from walls built by convict labour. The same year he absconded from Newcastle's lockup with a stolen horse and saddle. Moondyne Joe was buried in a pauper's grave in Fremantle Cemetery. His headstone bears the name of 3 other men, along with the image of a pair of broken handcuffs and the Welsh word Rhathfyd, which means freedom. If the man in our final story had gotten his hands on Moondyne, he may not have had a chance to make any of his daring escapes. John Clarence Woods never had the makings of a man you'd expect to grace the pages of a history book. Born in Wichita, Kansas in 1911, Woods was raised by his grandmother after his parents divorced. He dropped out of high school after 2 years and joined the US Navy in 1929. After a few months of service, Woods went AWOL and was eventually dishonorably discharged following a general court-martial. A psychiatric board determined that Woods suffered from psychopathic inferiority without psychosis and was unfit for service. Following his discharge, Woods returned to Kansas and worked his way through a string of manual labor jobs for the next decade. When the US entered World War II, he sought to regain his military career. In 1943, he enlisted in the Army and was assigned to Company B of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, 5th Engineer Special Brigade. After landing at Normandy on D-Day in 1944, Woods decided he'd seen enough combat and began seeking ways to get as far from the front line as possible. Before that point, American military executions in the European theatre were carried out by British personnel, often by Thomas Pierpont, aided by his nephew Albert. But with plenty of their own men now on European soil, and with executions set to take place in Paris, the Americans began seeking their own executioner. In late 1944, the US Army posted a job listing asking for experienced executioners. Woods saw it as his ticket away from the front lines and applied. He told the recruiters that he'd hanged 2 criminals in Texas and another 2 in Oklahoma. A check on these claims would have revealed that the 2 states had switched from hanging to the electric chair many years earlier, with their last gallows-based execution taking place when Woods was just 12. However, his lie worked and earned him a spot as a hangman at Paris's disciplinary training center. For his trouble, he received a generous raise and a promotion. For the next year, Woods executed at least 37 American soldiers in France, bungling at least 11 of these hangings. Matthew Clay, an American GI who was just 18 years old, dangled at the end of Woods' rope for an agonizing 17 minutes before finally passing away. In 1945, Woods began executing Germans. First, he hanged 3 for the murder of an American lieutenant. Then he executed 5 more who were involved in the Rüsselsheim massacre, in which 6 American airmen were lynched and killed by the townspeople. The following year, Woods oversaw the execution of 14 men convicted of committing concentration camp atrocities at Dachau. but it was his hanging of German policeman Justus Gerstenberg at Landsberg prison that attracted the attention of Lieutenant Stanley Tills, who had been tasked with organizing the executions at the Nuremberg trials. During Gerstenberg's hanging, he was hit in the face by the trapdoor of the gallows. The 100-kilogram door broke Gerstenberg's jaw and knocked out several of his teeth, but that didn't stop Woods from being tasked with executing the high-ranking Nazi officials recently sentenced to death at Nuremberg. 12 men were sentenced to hang for war crimes, including Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, who was still at large after being tried in absentia. Woods built and painted the gallows, stretched the ropes, and demonstrated the execution process to Russian delegates. The hangings were scheduled for the early morning hours of October 16, 1946. But one of the condemned, Hermann Göring, skirted his appointment with the hangman by ingesting cyanide in his cell just hours before. The remaining 10 convicted war criminals were hanged on 2 sets of gallows in the bomb-blasted gymnasium of the prison. While the US Army has consistently denied claims that errors in Wood's techniques caused the men to die slowly and agonizingly, there are enough eyewitness accounts to reveal the truth. The Nazis did not die quickly from broken necks. After suffering injuries similar to Gerstenberg's, they dangled, dying slowly of strangulation, with Woods being forced to tug on the bodies behind the trapdoors to finish the process. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, took a reported 28 minutes to die.
Oh dear, how sad, never mind.
Following the botched executions, Woods told the Sioux City Journal, 10 men and 103 minutes. That's fast work. He would later say, I hanged those 10 Nazis at Nuremberg and I'm proud of it. I never saw a hanging go any better. The condition Woods had previously been diagnosed with, constitutional psychopathic inferiority, is now known as antisocial personality disorder. This often challenging condition is on a spectrum, with those at the severe end said to display impulsive, irresponsible, and criminal behavior. They may also lack guilt, remorse, or concern for others, often being manipulative and quick to anger. It seems that Woods had fallen into the perfect job, but it has left some to wonder what his story may have been if he had not gotten the role of executioner and was simply left in a quiet town in Kansas. John remained with the army after the trials, and his work as a combat engineer eventually took him to the nuclear testing site at Inuitok Atoll in the South Pacific. On July the 21st, 1950, Woods was repairing an engineer lighting set when he was electrocuted and killed. His death was ruled as an accident, but some speculate that it was carefully planned by former Nazi scientists working on the atoll as part of Operation Paperclip. Whether execution or accident, John C. Wood's death was certainly faster and less painful than that of most of the 92 men who died at the end of his rope during his time as an executioner. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.